Hi, everybody. I'm Tabitha Doyle, and I work for Trend Micro as a Solutions Architect Associate. And lately, specifically, I've been diving into best practices. And so that's best practices in the cloud and also like using tools. So like the third-party tools like ours that you use and the best practices around how to utilize those. So I want to share some of that with you. So instilling confidence in cloud building, understanding best practices. Building confidently in the cloud, it can be challenging at times. So often we use the technology and then we find out that we could have been using it better, or we missed out on things that could have made it easier to use, more efficient, faster, or even sometimes like less expensive. So the key takeaways that I would like for you to have from this is understanding best practices, why you should use them, and then how to leverage them in work. So when I think of best practices, I kind of think of them similarly to note-taking in a sense. So you go to a meeting and you listen to everything that's going on, you think you understand it, and you're like, great, I've got this. And then later you find out that you missed some key things and you don't remember what was said in the meeting. So you learn your lesson. Next time you decide to take notes so that you will have all of those important things that are talked about in the meeting. So you take your notes and then later you find out that you shorthanded your notes so much that you don't understand them later. So the last time you have learned, you've figured out over the years how to take notes the right way so that whenever you go back to look at them, you remember everything from the meeting. And I think a best practice is kind of being that way, learning how not to do things and then how to do them better, and then maybe the best way to do them and the outcomes of that. Why best practices? Using best practices with tools you are using as well as building in the cloud, like using AWS, Azure, GCP, Kubernetes. You set up to be the most successful with what you're using. So you're more secure as you're building. You could know that you are secure, proficient with the services that you're using. You can be faster. You can be faster in building as well as faster environments. You know that what you're building out is going to be reliable. And then also there's the cost efficiency part of it. So kind of think of there being different flavors whenever it comes to best practices, right? So there's best practices while you're building in the cloud. So with AWS, Azure, and GCP, they all have a set of their best practices that they've created. And that's the industry experts getting together and deciding what's the best way to use the services that are out there. And this is their architecture framework. So for example, AWS has the well-architected framework, and they break this up into what they call pillars. So they have 5 pillars around these different concepts of building reliably, cost optimization, performance efficiency, operational excellence, and security. And then you have third-party tools, and this is your third-party tools that you might use for antivirus software or intrusion prevention, and how to set those tools up to get the best use out of those and be the most efficient use. And then there's also your code. You can shift your best practices left. So being able to do that early on before deploying anything. And then also, there's the best practices in your code as you're writing it. So I have a couple of examples here of these best practices. Every product or service being used has a bad, okay, good, and best way to be used. There's always more than one answer and many different use cases. There may not be a specific right answer, but there is a worst and there is a best. So for instance, whenever I first started learning to code, anytime, no matter which language I'm learning, they talk about how to comment in code. So, not using commenting is kind of looked at as, bad. You can, do comments and then find out later that you don't really understand what you wrote, and probably nobody else can understand that, but at least you are putting comments in there. And then, the best is like folding your comments or writing comments so that you or anybody else can understand what the comments are for this code and what the code is meant to accomplish. So similarly, you have tagging resources. So tagging or labeling resources in your cloud like AWS or Azure, not doing so is looked at as not the best practice. And then, maybe tagging some of your resources is better because then you have some tags. And then the best would be having some form of, requirement. So everybody has to put who the owner is and, what project these resources are for. And this not only helps you to find resources inside the cloud, but usually third-party vendors will utilize these tags so that you can organize within those tools. And then, security is a really big part of best practices. So like access control or encryption. So, not controlling the access to your environment or to your resources is not the best practice for sure, because then anybody could have access to it. You could add like one level of protection, such as an access control list, which is definitely better. And then also you can have multiple layers of protection, such as access control list, security groups, identity access management policies, to add those layers of protection. Encryption, not using encryption means that anybody can read what's there, can read your data. If you have encryption for data at rest, then they can't see it while it's sitting in like storage. If you have data at rest and in transit, that means that they can't see your data as you're sending it somewhere or while it's sitting. So that's usually considered the best practice. As mentioned earlier, there are many different use cases and we can't have the best in everything. Designing can take a bit of a strategic planning. You have to do a bit of balancing act to find the perfect fit for your goals. So at times, for greater performance, you might have to use a less restrictive security posture, or you have to spend a little bit more money to achieve the desired goal. So I have here 3 different diagrams of use cases to go over some of those common uses and builds and highlight the best practices in these scenarios. So here you have a basic web application, and I'm going to kind of break this up into those things that we highlighted earlier about reliability, proficiency, being faster, more secure. So here you can see that they have computing power. So this is AWS, but it translates to any type of building, right? So you have your computing power through the EC2s. And you can see that they're in different availability zones, which means that they're in different locations. And then you also have databases here, and you have 2 of them. You have a primary and a secondary so that it's a backup. And so this system is reliable because if you lose this availability zone, then you have a complete backup over here for that. So that is going to help you to have a reliable system. And this is definitely considered like one of the best practices, is to have that like failover. So proficient, so you have auto scaling. And if you're unfamiliar with what auto scaling is, you have these EC2s. So at all times you have 2 EC2s. But if they meet, capacity and they need backup, right? So you need more computing power. You have an elastic load balancer that will add more as you need them. So you have more EC2s that are being added. And so this helps you to not have downtime. There's not going to be lagging, and this is going to help you to have the best performance that you could have. And then also, auto scaling will scale back as needed as well. So if you're not using these other EC2 instances or computing power, then it scales it back. And so this helps you to save money as well. So you don't have any idle systems out there that aren't being utilized. And this is all like a part of, best practices, making sure you don't have those idle systems sitting out there that aren't being used, but they're accruing money, or making sure that you aren't having any downtime and you aren't slowing down because you don't have enough computing power. And then the reliability and making sure that if you do lose like an availability zone due to like the Texas Snowmageddon that we had and power is lost, and so you need to pull resources from somewhere else, it helps to solve the downtime problem. And then also, so things that can make it faster, like using a CloudFront distribution right here, which is kind of like caching. So you don't have to go all the way to this bucket that's over here. You have content that's right here and easy to pull from. And then you have the elastic load balancer here that is distributing an even amount of capacity against all of these EC2 instances. So you're not loading down one and then you have all these others that aren't being used. So security. Security is obviously a really, really big part of using best practices. So over here we have an S3 bucket. One of the most common things that you will see is that there are open S3 buckets. And many times it's really needed, right? So, but it's not the best practice. And so this kind of goes in the between the best and the worst, and like, what can you do to safeguard your S3 bucket that has to be open because you have a website where people are uploading photos all the time, and that's the main part of your entire website, right? So there are a couple of things that you can do to get that better than bad type of thing. One would be using CloudFront to pull the data from, or to write the data from, so then your S3 bucket can be private still, and everything is uploaded to CloudFront. Also, you could do something like have a third-party vendor that scans those files that are being uploaded to that S3 bucket. So this helps you to find different variations of not being able to maybe meet that best requirement, but finding something that's there, that's in between. There's also network security. So kind of along, the same lines. So you have this person here who is gaining access, but what if you have someone that you don't want to gain access? So are you using those access control list to make sure that only the people you want in there are gaining access, or closing off certain ports so that they're not gaining access to everything and maybe only in through the internet? And then also, do you know what is being pushed through? So like the content, the files that are being uploaded, like what events are happening with like a third-party IPS intrusion prevention or intrusion detection. And then here we also have, like your EC2 instances, so your workloads. Do you have safeguards for only allowing the people that need access to have access to that? So instead of granting access to everybody, maybe only you and your team needs to have access. So are you utilizing those security groups to make sure only the right people have access to the ports that they need? Do you have protection on those? Do you have like an antivirus, anti-malware, firewall, things like that to protect those? And that kind of brings up, best practices for third-party vendors and their products with the dreaded anti-malware, antivirus, right? Most people don't really like them because it slows down their systems. So, one of the things that is a best practice is using exceptions to help circumvent that slowdown. So exceptions in most tools are really important because it helps you to fine-tune those findings that you have, or to fine-tune the tool, right? So maybe you don't need to scan all of your directories. So you use an exception to not scan some of those because you know that they won't have viruses or anything like that in there. So now we can go to this next slide. And this slide here kind of just sums up everything that we talked about with the file storage and the network security and the workload security in that section of the security part. And then the faster and proficient and more reliable breakdown of that use case and diagram. So kind of talking still on the security part, there are some other things that weren't in that last diagram that are really important to talk about here as well, such as using serverless applications. So here in this diagram, you have this person here who is voting, like those shows that you watch, like Dancing with the Stars, and you vote with somebody, right? And so it kind of shows you how it goes through there and how they tally up those. And so that's kind of what's going on here. And, with application security, that's on your like Lambda functions. So there is actually an AWS top 10 of these problems that they have with the Lambda functions, such as, injections, broken authentications, using components and known vulnerabilities, and insufficient logging and monitoring, and what's being done to protect that. Like, what best practices are you using around protecting yourself against any of these vulnerabilities when it comes to your Lambda functions or your serverless? Do you have a protection for those SQL injections, remote command execution, and all of those? There are some third-party things out there that help to protect against those. And then also some other best practices that you can follow with not using IAM policies. That's the same for all of them, and restricting those accesses to these. So this use case kind of brings up containers, which was also not in the other one, but is something that's being used more and more all the time. And
Tabitha?
Yes.
We've got a few minutes left, so I just want to make sure you're aware of some of the timing here.
Okay. All right. No problems. Okay, so just the protection here on containers, do you know what's in your code basically? So do you have any vulnerabilities or that? So shifting left, finding all of these things beforehand in your source code, your infrastructure as code. Do you have misconfigurations? Do you have vulnerabilities? And can you stop these things before deploying them? And the sum up, sorry for pushing through all this, right? The sum up of this is you can automate all of these. Trend Micro does have the cloud one that covers all the things that we brought up, including showing you in your cloud your misconfigurations and how to remediate them and the best practices around those. And I do have a link here. If you scan this, that takes you to best practices